Well, it was brutal, it was violent, it lasted way too long, but at the end, the right side prevailed. But enough about my experience last night in San Antonio watching my University of Houston Cougars defeat Arizona. I'm here to talk about the Civil War in Texas, and particularly my experience kind of telling the Civil War story of Texas, some of the challenges that I've faced, how I've grown to think about it, and what I think some of the opportunities are for organizations like the Texas Center to tell that story more effectively to a whole new generation of people that don't know it going forward. So to kind of recap, as Don mentioned earlier, I wrote a series of books on the Civil War battles in Texas. And for many years, it has been a challenge to actually persuade people that there were Civil War battles in Texas. And it turns out there were. And those Civil War battles were some of the most unique and interesting in the country. They really were. The challenge has always been for me to convince people to learn about them in order to appreciate them and understand them. And so very early on, my friend Don Frazier and I got connected up as friends and colleagues, and I became a charter member of the Don Frazier fan club, and we started writing books on these fairly obscure battles. But as Don said earlier, it's not enough just to write books. We have books, they're out there, and people will read them or they won't read them. Maybe they don't even know they exist. How do you tell a story like this to the public? So the first category of Texas history I would suggest is stories that are undertold. And not undertold in the sense that there are not words in print on them. It's just how do we get those stories to the consciousness of people and make them interested in it? So very early on, this has been more than 30 years now, I started giving Civil War battlefield tours in Texas. And I've probably given more battlefield tours in Civil War Texas than anybody else ever. And one thing I've learned is that people really enjoy those. And it's not just people that have the same kind of gray hair that I have. It's younger people as well. So I've started giving tours for children. I've started giving tours to particularly 7th grade classes. I've found is a great place to deliver the story of Texas, the Civil War, make people knowledgeable about them. So I call these the undertold stories, but I think they're still important. And the reason I say that is you really can't understand the story of Texas without understanding what happened in Texas during the Civil War. Take Houston and Galveston, where I reside kind of part-time. You cannot understand a massive city like Houston without understanding the Civil War story of Galveston and Houston and how those two things fitted together and how we ended up at the end of the Civil War with Galveston being the last remaining port. You just can't. Remaining Confederate port. You just can't. You've got to understand that story. So I think that those stories, Civil War in Texas, are largely undertold, and we need to make them familiar to new generations of people. The second category of stories that I think are important, and I've worked on over the years, involves something that we haven't discussed today at all that I know of, and that is the maritime history of Texas. In the course of researching my books on Civil War battles in Texas, I got very interested in the Union ships that were often parts of these encounters. They were an incredibly important part of this. And we have shipwrecks off the Texas coast and in Galveston Bay that are associated with these battles. Gradually over time, I got kind of in this niche and I became the project historian for a number of important Texas shipwrecks, several of which have now been excavated or at least documented. And I'm currently serving as a Marine steward. I'm the only historian Marine steward for the Texas Historical Commission. And every time there's a big hurricane, something gets exposed on the beach, the THC sends out people like myself to investigate them, see what we can find out about it, and try to tell that story. But if I tell you that the Civil War in Texas on land is undertold, the general maritime history of Texas is way undertold. So I would call this more unexplored and evolving Texas history, because we know 100 times more about the Texas history stories on land than we do about the stories of Texas history that involve our maritime coast. And again, remember, we have a gigantic coast in Texas, and there are all those cultural and archaeological remains right off of the coast. Just this week, for example, I know many of you read about this incredible deep water wreck that was found, not in Texas, this is off of Mississippi, but the deep water wreck of a whaling ship that had gone down in the Gulf. And it's a beautifully preserved wreck, and it's going to be neat to see that thing actually documented and pulled up. But I got emails from a ton of people asking me, I didn't know there were whales in the Gulf of Mexico. And I certainly didn't know that there was a whaling industry at one time in the Gulf of Mexico, but there was. And so there are a lot of stories like that I think we're going to have to see develop over time. We've got to find a way to make them interesting and engage people. And like on one expedition I went on, we went out to the wreck of the USS Hatteras, did laser measurements all around it, and produced a 3D fly-through movie. NOAA did. It's online on YouTube, that the kids can actually dive through the wreck and see what remains of it. It's just fascinating stuff if it's presented correctly. So that's sort of my second category of stuff, evolving and unknown. And then the third category of things I would think about, particularly in my own career, are stories that are completely untold. And when I say untold, I mean completely untold. Some of you may know that I wrote a book that we published last year, and State House was kind enough to publish it for me, on Juneteenth. And for many, many years, I would take people on battlefield tours down in Galveston, lead them to this vacant lot, and say, here something important happened. And I started leading these tours, like I said, 30 years ago. And it was not uncommon when I got there to this particular lot and said, this is important. This is really important ground. This is where the Juneteenth order was issued. And people would say, June what? They didn't even know what it was. I mean, it was not part of their community. They really weren't familiar with the story. And so this has been a story that I've been actually researching and working on for probably close to 40 years. The timing was just unbelievable last year. We put out the book, and then a month after the book came out, we had the nation's first Juneteenth holiday. But my book was the very first, and it is to this day, as far as I know, the only scholarly history of the events that actually took place in Galveston on Juneteenth. So think about that. We now have a national holiday for an event that is homegrown in Texas, that influences people not only in the United States, but now increasingly all over the world. And yet there was only one scholarly book on the subject that was published a month before the first celebration. Now, this is a story that has basically forced itself onto the national scene, and yet as a historical community, until my book, we still didn't have any agreement on what the basic facts were. Every year you'd see something in the newspaper about Gordon Granger coming up on a balcony and reading the Emancipation Proclamation to a huge crowd of people. Spoiler alert, that never happened, and there's no contemporary evidence that supports it. So we need to have a new understanding. We need to backfill some of these stories that are kind of forcing themselves into the public conscious, and we need to do a better job of researching those things, getting the facts out there, and making people aware of them. And I will say from my own experience, you might look at me and say, why is this guy writing about Juneteenth? And some of the groups I speak to, have that question as a natural thing. But what I have found is I give basically the same talk on Juneteenth, regardless of whether it is a civil rights group, and I've done a lot of those talks to black groups all across the country, or Sons of Confederate Veterans. It's basically the same talk. And what I've found is that people are interested in the facts behind the event. And if you present it in an interesting and engaging way, and you just tell them the facts behind it, they appreciate it, and people come away from that story with a new appreciation of, one, what happened, two, why it's important, and three, what it means to Texans, Americans, and people around the world today. So in conclusion, I just want to say I think my little career, and I'm a non-academic historian, is sort of a microcosm of what's going on in Texas history generally. We have stories that are undertold that we need to tell to people in new and engaging ways. We have stories that are evolving and unknown, like our maritime history stories. And then there are big issues, things like Juneteenth, that we need to really fill in the gaps and make available to a whole history-loving community. And it's kind of like the Field of Dreams thing. If you build it, they will come. My belief is that if we do that, if we manage to tell these stories in the way I've kind of outlined needs to happen, I think people will come and appreciate it. And who is in position to help us build it and make those people come to us? My way of thinking, it's the Texas Center, and that's the mission I see, and I applaud them for it. Thank you.